A simple but effective way to make sure that each of our song sections are doing their job and are doing an effective job is to really just have some goals for those sections. If we ask ourselves, hey, is this bridge good or not? Well, what makes a good bridge? What are some goals that a bridge should normally accomplish in context of our song? So in this video, we're going to talk about goals for our bridges. So the first goal is probably a really obvious goal, but I think it needs to be said. It needs to avoid being a poor man's chorus. So often a bridge does end up feeling like the same thing to a chorus that a second verse is to a first verse, which is that sometimes it says some of the same stuff, it has a similar feel, it just is less memorable. Therefore, it didn't make the cut of being the chorus, it just is kind of this disappointing alternate chorus thing. Now, that's not to say that you can't have a bridge that stylistically feels like a double down on what the chorus is doing. For example, sometimes there will be bridges that keep the same chord progression from the chorus and just change up the melody. There's nothing wrong with that, but a lot of times a bridge should be a significant change up. Usually you're changing something significantly on the rhythm side. Often the drums will change up quite a bit. Sometimes you do things like cut to halftime or do double time, switch to the relative minor key, or sometimes you might not switch to the relative minor key technically, but you do have a more minor based bridge that uses a lot of that minor 6 chord or maybe that minor 2 chord when your chorus was mostly utilizing your 1 chord and your 5 chord and your 4 chord, which are all your major chords in the context of a major key. Often you do want your bridge to really feel like a different section. Overall, you should just make sure that when a listener is listening to your song, it shouldn't be like, oh, is this the bridge? It should be like, oh, here's the bridge. It should be very obvious when your bridge comes. Otherwise, it's probably not different enough and doesn't stand out enough relative to your chorus. On the lyrical side, something that you can do to make sure that your bridge stands out and has a job and is doing something in the song that's actually important to do is you can switch up where you are in the timeline. For example, if you've been mostly in the present and telling stories from the past, maybe your bridge can go into, hey, here's a possible future, or here's the future that I fear, or here's the future that I look forward to. And then beyond just timeline things, you can also alternate perspective. For example, if you spent the entire song sort of moping, which, hey, I've been there, so no judgment, but if you spent the whole time moping about, oh, you broke my heart, I'm so sad, maybe the bridge is where you shift your perspective and you're like, you know what? You kind of sucked. So, you know what? This is a good thing. I'm going to be okay. Or maybe it's the opposite, right? You spend the whole time hating on someone like, oh, you broke my heart. You're a terrible person. I never should have been with you. But then on the bridge, you're like, actually, you know what? You were pretty great and I appreciate my time with you, even though it didn't work out. Regardless, changing your perspective in the bridge or giving some form of plot twist in the bridge can be an effective way to make sure that it stands out and is significantly different than your chorus. A simple question to ask yourself that might be helpful would be, are the lyrics in this section worthy of the music? Because there is only one time in your whole song, usually, that bridge music will come. The chorus will get repeated. The verse music gets repeated, even though the lyrics are going to change most of the time. But the bridge usually only comes once. It's that one change up you get in the song. Are your lyrics worthy of that? If the answer is no, maybe it's time to go back and rework those lyrics. Another job of your bridge is to connect seamlessly with what happened before it, as well as after it. Specifically, musically, you want to think about this because you don't want a weird, awkward transition from your chorus into your bridge. So what chord does your chorus end on? Does your chorus end on a 1 chord? In which case you can go to pretty much any chord and it sound pretty natural at the beginning of your bridge. And then also think about how it connects lyrically, right? Does the end of your chorus lyric connect well with the beginning of what you're saying in your bridge? Or is it a really unnatural transition? And usually, when it comes to your bridge, it's almost always going to be preceded by a chorus. But then sometimes what happens at the end of your bridge is either right back into a chorus, or another common thing that happens is it actually goes into a final verse, often a verse 3. So if it goes into the verse, you have to think about what type of verse 3 that is. For example, a very common thing that will happen is you'll have a bridge that might be high energy, but then your third verse, which happens right after your bridge, is actually the lowest energy point in the song. It's the one part of the song that actually has less going on than even the first verse. So in that case, case, a good idea might be either to have a bridge that actually is very restrained. That way it goes from a big chorus into a kind of intimate bridge, and then it goes into an intimate third verse before building back up into the big chorus, or maybe you have a small chorus at the end of your song. Probably much more commonly, you have a big bridge after your chorus, but the way your bridge ends is sort of in a way where it sort of dissipates, and then that small verse kind of comes creeping back up. End on like power chords just ringing out at the end of your bridge. And then that main piano riff from your verse kind of comes back, and it's just the piano riff and you singing again for that third verse. And then maybe that third verse may or may not build back into a chorus or explode back into a chorus if you don't actually build the verse within the verse. But we're not worried about the third verse because we're talking about the bridge in this video. Ultimately, you need to be thinking about how you want the bridge to connect on both the front end and on the back end, making sure that the chorus goes seamlessly into this bridge and adjusting this bridge if it doesn't, and making sure that whatever this bridge is meant to go into, whether it's another verse or whether it is the chorus again, that it also connects seamlessly and not in an awkward way. And another goal for our bridge is to either conclude the story, which is probably most common, or to actually set up the conclusion of our story, which will then usually take place in the third verse. So very often, the second verse doesn't actually wrap up the story of our song, even though very often we will only have two verses and the chorus won't actually deal with the story at all. If we think about the most common song structure of all, which is verse, chorus, bridge, chorus, we have choruses, which tend to be very thematic and not as story-driven, and then we have verses and the bridge, which means that if our second verse doesn't wrap up the story, who will? Well, the bridge, which actually is great because that makes it so that we can have sort of a perfect 3-act structure to our story, or 3 parts of a trilogy, if you want to see it that way, where that second verse is that second part of the trilogy, and then you wrap it up in the bridge. So very often, especially if you have a verse, chorus, bridge, chorus structure, you very often are going to wrap up the story in the bridge, not actually in the verses. But if we have a song structure like verse, chorus, bridge, verse, chorus, in that case, usually your 3-act story structure will be contained mostly in your verses because you have 3 verses. And maybe that bridge certainly adds to the story still as well, but in that case, it doesn't need to and probably shouldn't wrap up the story because there's still a third verse coming after. So instead, you sort of need to, toss the ball up, set the ball so that the last verse, that third verse, can be the one to spike it in people's faces, metaphorically. That whole analogy kind of went off the rails. We need to get a perfect pass from that bridge to that third verse so that the third verse is well equipped to finish out the story. So maybe, for example, you might have a bridge where the big twist is in the bridge, and then after you get that big twist, then that third verse is actually where you then conclude the story in context of the new information of the big twist in the story that you got in the bridge. Overall, just make sure that you're not missing out on all the opportunities that a bridge can give you. It can be a great place to deliver a twist before you wrap up a story in a third verse. It can be a great place to actually wrap up the story in the case of not having a third verse, and then you still have that 3-act structure to your story. Overall, don't underestimate how much a bridge can bring on the story side of things. And don't just assume that, maybe it should be thematic, sort of like a chorus, which I think is pretty common for people to do. But often I think that might be a mistake because it might end up being something where it's way more effective wrapping up the story than it is being another thematic element of the song, another part of the song that really is mostly by theme and not really adding to the story. You already have the chorus, which is doing that super effectively, but sometimes 2 verses aren't quite enough to deliver the total final story. So hopefully this was helpful to you. If it was, something else you may find helpful is my 10 different ways to start writing a song free guide. It gives 5 ways to start a song from a lyrical standpoint and 5 ways to start from a musical standpoint. So whether you like starting with lyrics or with music, there's 5 different ways for you. And regardless which one you prefer, I recommend at least giving a good shot to the other one. I used to be religiously lyrics first, and I've actually changed where now I find that it's more effective for me personally to start with music, but also it can be just good to mix up how we start our songs, because sometimes if you just keep grabbing a guitar and starting with a chord progression, you'll sort of start to run creatively dry. Your songs might start to sound the same. Regardless, it can be really helpful just to change it up a little bit and sit with a guitar, but this time be like, you know what? Instead of a chord progression, why don't I start with writing a bass line on my acoustic guitar? And that can be something that is super helpful to staying creatively fresh, changing up what instrument we write with, changing up how we write with that instrument, changing up what part of the song we write first. Instead of a chord progression, maybe starting with a hook, or instead of a hook, starting with the melody. So if you're interested in that, be sure to check that out. Link in the description down below. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate every single one of you. I'll talk to you in the next one.